The verdict price. The trial had been running for 19 months. It was the largest corporate espionage prosecution the Department of Justice had brought in 7 years. A case built on 400,000 documents, 63 witnesses, and the testimony of 3 former employees who had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for immunity. The defendant was a Chinese state-linked technology conglomerate accused of systematically stealing semiconductor design data from American firms, running a parallel intelligence collection operation through its US subsidiary, and routing the stolen intellectual property through a series of shell entities in Singapore and the Cayman Islands, back to a research division in Shenzhen that was developing next-generation chip architecture for military applications. The financial damage to the American companies whose research had been stolen was assessed at between $14 and $22 billion. The national security implications of the stolen technology reaching Chinese military applications were assessed in a classified annex to the indictment as significant and long-term. The jury had been deliberating for 11 days. At 9:23 p.m. on a Tuesday, a deputy marshal with the Judicial Security Division received an encrypted message from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, flagged urgent. Immediate response required. She read it once. She read it again. Then she called the duty commander directly, bypassing the standard reporting chain, because the standard reporting chain was part of the problem. The message contained a single operative finding. A Chinese Ministry of State Security asset embedded within the case prosecution team had been transmitting juror personal data, home addresses, family member names, vehicle registrations, daily schedules, to a handler operating out of the Chinese consulate in Houston. The transmission had been occurring for 6 weeks. The most recent transmission, intercepted 40 minutes ago, included updated address information for 7 of the 12 sitting jurors and 2 alternates. The updated information suggested active physical surveillance had been conducted on those individuals within the past 72 hours. The jury was still deliberating. They had not yet returned a verdict, and someone inside the prosecution had been feeding the Chinese intelligence apparatus everything it needed to reach 9 of them. The duty commander was on the phone to the Marshal's operations center at 9:31 p.m. The compromised individual was a senior trial attorney in the DOJ's National Security Division, a prosecutor with 16 years of federal service, a security clearance at the TS/SCI level, and direct access to every piece of case material, including the protected juror information that the court had ordered sealed at the start of trial. Juror identities in federal cases of this sensitivity were maintained under strict access controls. The list of individuals authorized to view juror personal data was short, deliberately limited, and logged with every access. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division had been tracking what they assessed as a Chinese intelligence recruitment and cultivation operation, targeting DOJ personnel for 11 months. The operation had been patient and methodical, in the way that Chinese state intelligence operations characteristically were. Long development cycles, slow trust building, no early asks. The asset had first been identified not through his own behavior, but through the behavior of his handler, a consulate official who'd been under surveillance for a different suspected operation and whose contact pattern had shifted 8 months ago in a way that suggested a new and active source. mapping the handler's contacts backward through financial records, encrypted communication metadata, and physical surveillance had taken 7 months. The asset had been identified 4 weeks ago. The decision to allow the operation to continue running under surveillance. Immediately arresting the asset had been made at a senior FBI level, with the rationale that allowing the operation to continue would reveal the full scope of what had been transmitted and potentially identify additional assets in the chain. That decision had costs that were now landing directly on the Marshal's desk. For 4 weeks, the FBI had watched a federal prosecutor transmit juror data to a hostile foreign intelligence service and had not told the Marshals, had not told the court, and had not taken protective action for the jurors whose information was being handed to the MSS. The argument for the delay was operational. The result of the delay was 9 jurors whose home addresses, family structures, and daily routines were now in a database maintained by the Chinese Ministry of State Security, accessible to whatever assets the MSS chose to activate. The duty commander listened to the full briefing in silence. Then she said, "How long have we had 11 days of jury deliberations with the jurors under active hostile surveillance?" The FBI liaison on the call did not have a clean answer. The duty commander said, "I'm activating emergency juror protection now. I need the full juror list, current addresses confirmed, and family member data within 20 minutes. She had it in 14. 12 sitting jurors, 3 alternates who had been released from active participation, but who still held protected information about the trial, and whose identities had been included in the MSS transmission. The Marshals were now responsible for 15 individuals across a metropolitan area of 3 million people. In the middle of the night, with an unknown threat profile and a hostile intelligence service that had been watching some of these individuals for up to 6 weeks. 6 weeks of surveillance meant 6 weeks of pattern documentation. The MSS wouldn't need to run fresh reconnaissance to find these people. They already knew where they lived, where their children went to school, what vehicles they drove, what time the lights went off at night. 6 weeks was enough time to build an operational file on each juror that was more detailed than what most private investigators could assemble in 3 months. The threat model was not immediately obvious. The MSS was not a cartel. Its primary objective was not murder. It was influence. The question that the Marshals threat assessment team was working through in real time at 9:45 p.m. on a Tuesday was what influence in this context meant. If the jury returned a guilty verdict, what did the MSS do with the files they had built? The trial attorney who had been transmitting the data was not transmitting into a void. Someone had requested it. Someone had a plan for it. And that plan had a trigger point. The trigger point was the verdict. If the jury convicted, the files became leverage. Jurors in a high-profile federal case had lives, families, employers, financial situations. A foreign intelligence service with 6 weeks of detailed personal data on 12 individuals had options that went well beyond physical intimidation. They could approach jurors through cutouts and proxies. They could expose personal information in ways that created professional or personal consequences. They could make anonymous reports to employers, to local authorities, to anyone who would act on them. In a case with post-trial civil proceedings, juror information could be used to contaminate the record, to manufacture grounds for appeal, to argue misconduct, and they could, if the calculation shifted, do something more direct. That was the scenario the marshals had to prevent, regardless of probability. The duty commander made the call at 9:52 p.m. All 15 jurors under protective contact before midnight. She had 91 minutes. The jury had been sequestered for the final 4 days of deliberations, a precaution the judge had ordered after 2 jurors reported feeling followed during an earlier recess period. The sequestration had been treated as a procedural matter. It was now, in retrospect, the decision that made the marshal's job manageable rather than impossible. 8 of the 12 sitting jurors were in the sequestration hotel, a downtown property with marshals already on site as standard protocol for the sequestration period. Those 8 were already in a secured environment. The marshals on site were briefed by encrypted radio at 10:04 p.m. and immediately shifted to an elevated security posture without alerting the jurors. The hotel's external access points were secured. Surveillance on the perimeter was doubled. The 8 jurors went to sleep that night in rooms that had, in the past hour, quietly become considerably more protected than they had been at dinner. The 4 sitting jurors not currently sequestered had been excused for medical or family reasons that the judge had accommodated. A juror managing a parent's medical crisis, a juror with a minor child who required care that couldn't be arranged otherwise, and 2 who had documented health conditions that made extended hotel stays medically inadvisable. These 4 were at their own homes. They were the immediate priority. The 3 released alternates were the complication. They had been dismissed from active jury service weeks earlier, had returned to their normal lives, and had no reason to believe they were still within the protective orbit of the trial. They were living normally, going to work normally, following routines that the MSS had been documenting for weeks. Teams went out simultaneously at 10:08 p.m. The first home contact, a juror on the north side of the city, a retired engineer in his late 60s who lived alone, went smoothly. He opened the door in pajamas, heard the deputy's identification, and stepped back to let them in with the calm of someone who had spent a career in systems that required trust in authority. He asked one question: was his vote going to count? The deputy marshal said yes. The man put on his shoes and coat and went with them. The second home contact was harder. A juror in her early 40s, 2 teenage children, a husband who worked night shifts at a regional distribution center. She opened the door to 2 federal deputies at 10:31 p.m., and her first response was that something had happened to her husband. The deputy lead said no, her husband was fine. This was about the trial. She and her children needed to come with them now. She stood in the doorway for 4 seconds. Then she turned around and called her children's names up the stairs. The third home contact required coordination with local police because the juror's address was in a gated community with access restrictions. By the time the deputies had worked through the gate management system and reached the residence, it was 10:54 p.m. The juror came to the door before they knocked. She had seen the vehicles on her security camera and was already dressed. She said she had felt watched for the past 2 weeks. She said she had mentioned it to her husband, who had told her she was being paranoid. She picked up a pre-packed overnight bag from behind the door. The deputy marshal noted in the post-operation report that the bag suggested the juror had been preparing for this moment on some level of instinct for days. She was right. She had been watched for 2 weeks. The MSS file on her home included 17 time-stamped photographs taken from a vehicle parked on her street. The 4th home contact, the juror managing the parents' medical crisis, required the most sensitivity. The juror's parent was hospitalized at a facility 12 miles from the home. The juror had been cycling between the house and the hospital on a schedule the deputies confirmed matched exactly with the pattern documented in the MSS surveillance file. The deputies made contact at the house at 11:07 p.m. The juror asked about the parent. The duty commander had already arranged for secure liaison with the hospital's patient services coordinator. The parent would be moved to a private room with security access controls by morning. The juror was in transport by 11:19 p.m. All 4 non-sequestered sitting jurors were secured by 11:23 p.m. Tuesday, 37 minutes before midnight. The 3 released alternates took until 1:40 a.m. Wednesday to fully secure due to distances and the coordination required to make contact with individuals who were not expecting any continued involvement with the trial's protective apparatus. One alternate was reached at her workplace, a late shift at a hospital, where she took the call from the Marshals in a supply closet and spent 6 minutes convincing herself it was real, before agreeing to meet a deputy at the staff exit. Another was visiting family in a neighboring state and required coordination with that state's Marshal's district for a same-night contact and protective arrangement. By 2:15 a.m. Wednesday, all 15 individuals were either secured or under confirmed protective contact. The prosecution attorney was arrested at 6 a.m. Wednesday at his home in a northern suburb. 2 FBI counterintelligence agents and a supervisor made the approach. He came to the door in workout clothes. He ran at 5:30 a.m. every morning, a routine that was documented in his own personnel file and that the FBI had been watching for the past 4 weeks. He saw the credentials. He looked at the faces. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked if he could call his attorney. He was told yes, and that he should do so now. He was charged with acting as an unregistered foreign agent, unauthorized disclosure of protected court information, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and transmission of national defense information to a foreign power. The indictment, when it was unsealed 3 weeks later, ran to 44 counts. The full scope of what he had transmitted over the 6 weeks of active MSS contact, the period the FBI had documented under surveillance, included not only juror data, but internal prosecution strategy documents, witness contact information, and attorney-client communications from the immunity agreements with the 3 cooperating witnesses. The cooperating witnesses were immediately placed under emergency protective review. 2 required relocation. 1 had already been approached by an intermediary. Not physically threatened, but contacted under a pretext that the post-arrest investigation concluded was an MSS probe to assess whether the immunity agreement could be destabilized. The consulate official identified as the asset's handler departed the United States on a diplomatic flight 48 hours after the arrest. A standard intelligence service response when an asset is burned and the handler's cover is at risk of exposure. The FBI had anticipated the departure and had a documentation package prepared for the State Department, which was used in subsequent diplomatic proceedings. 3 additional MSS-connected individuals identified through the handler's contact network during the investigation were expelled from the country over the following 60 days under the same proceedings. The jury returned its verdict on Thursday morning, 36 hours after the emergency protective operation had secured all 15 individuals, and 24 hours after the trial, attorney's arrest had been made public in a DOJ press release that described the charges in factual terms without disclosing the full scope of what had been transmitted. The jurors were in a secure environment when they heard the news about the arrest. Several asked the marshals on site whether the verdict would still count. They were told yes. The prosecution's conduct was being handled separately. The case itself was built on evidence that stood independently of any single prosecutor, and the verdict was the jury's to deliver. It took them 4 more hours of deliberation. The verdict was guilty on all primary counts. The post-operation review was one of the most consequential internal documents the Marshal's Judicial Security Division produced in a decade. Its central finding was not about the prosecution attorney's conduct. That was an FBI and DOJ matter. Its central finding was about the 4-week gap between the FBI's identification of an active hostile intelligence operation targeting sealed juror data and the moment the marshals were notified. 4 weeks, 28 days, during which 15 individuals were under active MSS surveillance, with their personal data being transmitted to a foreign intelligence service, and the agency responsible for their protection was not informed. The operational logic of allowing the surveillance to continue for intelligence gathering purposes was documented, evaluated, and found to be in fundamental conflict with the Marshal's protective mandate. The review's recommendation, which was subsequently adopted as formal interagency protocol, required that any confirmed foreign intelligence operation targeting sealed court participants, including jurors, be reported to the Marshal's Judicial Security Division within 24 hours of confirmation. Regardless of the FBI's operational interest in allowing the operation to continue, the alternate timeline constructed by the review team began with a simple question. What was the MSS's plan for the juror data if the verdict had gone the other way? The answer, assembled from the handler's communications and from intelligence community analysis of MSS operational doctrine in high-stakes commercial litigation cases, was detailed and chilling. The files built over 6 weeks of surveillance were not contingency material. They were active operational assets. In the event of a guilty verdict, which was the outcome the MSS most needed to prevent or undermine, the files would have been used in 3 phases: immediate post-verdict juror contact, through proxies offering financial inducements to provide statements suggesting jury misconduct, parallel exposure of jurors' personal information through anonymous channels designed to create pressure and media attention, and targeted approach of the 3 jurors whose financial and personal situations had been assessed as making them most susceptible to ongoing influence. The objective was not to reverse the verdict in the courtroom. The objective was to manufacture sufficient post-verdict controversy to support an appeal, to contaminate the evidentiary record, and to create a litigation environment in which the conviction became practically unenforceable, while the actual technology theft continued under new corporate structures. None of that happened. 15 people slept in secure locations on Tuesday night. The verdict stood. The conviction produced an evidentiary record that the government used in 3 subsequent related proceedings. The juror who had the pre-packed bag behind her door, the one who said she had felt watched for 2 weeks, was interviewed as part of the post-operation debrief. She confirmed the bag. She confirmed the feeling. She said she didn't know what she had expected to happen, only that something felt wrong in the weeks before the end, and that she had decided to be ready. The deputy marshal who conducted the debrief asked if she would have served on the jury again. Knowing what she knew now, she said yes. She said the verdict was right, and she stood by it, and that if feeling watched for 2 weeks was the price of standing by it, then that was what it cost. The deputy marshal wrote that in the report. It was the last line of the operational summary.